So let's talk a little bit about the passive voice and the other voices. I'm looking at Duff on page, I don't have these page numbers marked yet. Anyway, it's the beginning of chapter 15, so let's go with that. So chapter 15, the first page there. Passive is the voice that we use. That's what we call the voice when the subject is not the one doing the action. So here we have some examples, and I'm just going to look at the English, but the Greek there, of course, is passive as well. Romans 11:26, and thus all Israel will be saved. Now, if Israel was doing the saving, we would say all Israel will save. But Israel isn't the one doing the saving. Israel is the one that is that the action is acting upon, right? So Israel is being saved. And this sentence doesn't tell us who's actually doing the saving. And passive sentences can either tell us who that is or can leave it blank. And we'll see that in a minute. The important thing to see here is that Israel is not doing the saving. Luke 2:4, Joseph also went up from Galilee to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. So that city is not the one doing the calling. The city is being called. Somebody else has named the city Bethlehem. Matthew 3:10, therefore every tree not producing good fruit is cut down and is thrown into the fire. The tree is not doing the cutting, and the tree is not doing the throwing. The tree is the one that's being cut and being thrown. So in English, the way we make the passive is by using the be verb and one of the participles, either the past participle or the present participle. Romans 5:1, therefore, having been justified through faith, we have peace towards God. We are not doing the justifying. We are the ones who are being justified. Now, if we go down to the bottom of the page, we see another example, Mark 1:9, and here the sentence tells us who is actually doing the action. He was baptized in the Jordan by John. So he, whoever he is not doing the baptizing, but we find out later in the sentence that John is doing the baptizing. So he was baptized by John. In the Greek, we can write by John by using the preposition hupo and the genitive. So when you have a passive verb and you have hupo and a genitive, you're going to translate that as by, and you're going to know that that tells us the subject of the sentence. Now, when we have that by John phrase or the hupo phrase in Greek, we can, not to translate, but just so we understand what's going on with the passive, we can flip the subject and the object of the preposition. So if we wanted to put this in the active form, we would say, John baptized him in the Jordan. Now we have the subject is John. John is doing the baptizing. That's the active voice like we've always had it. But this is what happens when you get the passive voice. The direct object becomes the subject. So he was baptized. The subject is no longer doing the action, and the one doing the action may or may not be in the sentence, but if the one doing the action is in the sentence, it'll be in a prepositional phrase starting with by in English or hupo in Greek. He was baptized in the Jordan by John. Now, Greek not only has active voice and passive voice, Greek also has this thing called middle voice. And Duff is going to sort of put that in parentheses and come back to the middle voice later. Now, we're going to look at the forms that the middle and passive take, but I want to point out that when Duff at the bottom of the bottom of 15.3 says ruomai is used as the exemplar in the middle rather than luo because the middle is normally used only for deponent verbs. That's just not true. a verb like luomai can be used in all the different voices. And so that's why I've given it to you in a form where you can see them all. So let's take a look at these forms. So most of these you already know. I've added a little bit, but let's talk about why I gave you the forms of ruomai at the end of luo, right? And that's because I wanted you to learn them in this form so that you know them already when we start talking about voice. So let's start with the indicative forms. And if we look at the present tense, you already know that the present active is luo, lues, lue, luomen, luete, luosin. And those are the forms you're going to use if you, for example, say, I am loosening his bonds. I am releasing him. Let's use that sentence. I am releasing him. Now, if we want to put it in the passive, we're going to say then we're going to say, well, let's do it this way. He is being released by me. Now, in the present tense, the middle and passive voices both take the same form. So you have to, when you translate, you have to figure out, does this verb have a passive meaning or does this verb have a middle meaning? So if you wanted to say, he is being released by me, you're going to use this form luetai. So in the present tense, middle passive forms, and again, you already know these endings, luomai, lue, luetai, luomitha, lueste, luontai. Future active, I will release him. Luso, luseis, lusei, lusomen, lusete, lususin. The middle forms, and again, we'll talk about meaning in a few minutes. The middle forms for the future you already know, lusomai, luse, lusatai, lusomitha, luseste, lusontai. But here's the new forms. If you wanted to say he will be released, or he will be released by me, you would use these forms, and notice that they're all the same in that they have the theta eta in the forms, and also the sigma. So we get luthesomai, luthese, luthesetai, luthesomitha, luceste, luthesontai. It's kind of a tongue twister. Now, in the imperfect, we know these forms. We have eluon, elues, eluen, eluomen, eluete, eluon. So these are the ones when you want to say, I was releasing him. But now if you wanted to say he was being released, you would use these middle passive forms that you already know. Eluomen, eluu, elueto, eluometha, elueste, eluonto. For the aorist, we have, again, forms that we already know. If I was going to say, I released him, it would be one of these forms, elusa, elusas, elusen, elusamen, elusate, elusan. If you wanted to use a middle form, again, we'll talk about the meaning of the middle in a few minutes, but if you wanted to use the middle form, you would get elusamen, eluso, elusato, elusametha, elusaste, elusanto. And if you wanted to use the passive form, so now you're talking about he was released, you would use eluthe, eluthes, eluthe, eluthemen, eluthete, eluthesan. Now, the imperatives, you know the active, so lue, luete, so release. But if you wanted to say be released, you would say lu and lueste. The aorist, we don't translate in the passive. These would have the sense of ongoing motion. So you might say, be releasing for lue and be being released for lu. And then luson would be release, and lusai would have this middle sense, which we'll get to. And if you wanted the passive, this would be released, lutheti and luthete. Participles, You already know luon, luusa. So this is releasing. Luon, luontos. And I've changed this to the genitive because if you know these forms, the genitive and the datives, then you will be able to figure out all the other forms. Luuses, luontos, luusin. And then the passive would be being released. So luomenos, luomene, luomenon. Again, you know these from ruomai. Luomenu, luomenes, luomenu. And then with the aorist, you already know lusas, lusasa, lusan, lusantos, lusases, lusantos, and lusasin. And then we have the middle form, which we don't know how to translate yet, but we have lusamenas, lusamen, lusamenan, lusamenu, lusamenes, lusamenu. And then in the passive, so this would be having been released. So luthes, luthesa, luthen, luthentos, lutheses, luthentos, luthesi. And then if we go up and look at the present, we have the infinitives, so to release, luein. And then the middle passive, we would translate that as to be released, luestai. And these would have a sense of ongoing action, which is difficult to translate in English. But in the aorist, it would simply be the standard forms for the infinitive, lusai for to release, lusastai for the middle, which we'll talk about in a minute, and luthenai for the passive infinitive, to be released. So those are the passive and active voice forms, as well as the middle voice forms. I will do another video to talk more about meaning.